Hi, and welcome to part 3 of Why Intolerance and Extremism Happen and what we can do about all the anger and division. Last time, I talked about ideological thinking and existence pain. This time, I'll talk about a thing called the Democratic Big Bang, our founding conditions, and how that motivates much of the anger and division we see. I'm Teri Kanefield. Thank you for joining me. Now, let's look more closely at the kinds of conditions that make people panic and feel prolonged fear, the kind of fear that makes them vulnerable to a demagogue's appeal. You've probably heard the phrase, "These are the times that try men's souls." That's the famous first line from a pamphlet written by Thomas Paine in December 1776. It was the start of a series called The American Crisis, which he signed by the author of Common Sense. Here's what was happening at the time. The Continental Army had just been defeated and enlistments were running out. The colonists were not simply fighting a faraway king, they were challenging the dominant global superpower of the 18th century. This meant that if you enlisted, you stood a good chance of being killed. Paine's pamphlet was a rallying cry. It was meant to persuade and encourage the colonists to keep fighting the war. In 1964, political scientist Murray Edelman said this: "All times are the times that try men's souls. The age one lives in is always in crisis, and especially so since newspaper reading became common." Newspaper reading changed everything because suddenly people were informed of events outside their immediate experience. There were some big ones, of course: World War I, World War II, understanding the meaning of nuclear bombs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, but he's talking about something different. He's talking about all ages. To illustrate Edelman's idea, let's take the example of the dwindling interest in the Revolutionary War at the end of 1776. One of the main drivers of the Revolutionary War was that the colonists objected to being taxed by a distant government in which they had no representation. That's why the Tea Party was such a defining moment. Most Americans at the time were subsistence farmers or laborers. We can assume, therefore, that the price of tea did not affect their daily lives. Subsistence farmers probably didn't want to leave the fields that fed their families and risk their lives in a war just so someone they vote for will have a say in their tax bill, particularly if there was no guarantee that the tax bill would go down. The farmer needed a reason worth dying for, and those reasons were given as abstractions like independence and liberty. Edelman explains that all times are the times that try men's souls because every political act terrifies someone while reassuring someone else. Let's take, as an example, the McCarthy era. The anti-communist campaigns in the early 1950s when people were accused of being disloyal or un-American. The McCarthy era was terrifying to those who saw the government seeking out and punishing people for their political views. They saw this as an abhorrent violation of civil liberties and the First Amendment. On the other hand, it was reassuring to those who were terrified of a Stalinist-style communist revolution coming to the United States. McCarthy supporters believed that aggressive action was necessary to prevent the spread of communism. They saw what happened in Russia, and they were terrified that the same thing would happen in the United States. So to some, the McCarthy era was the worst of times. To others, they were the best of times because, as they saw the situation, someone was aggressively rooting out the dangers of communism. Let's take, as another example, the campus protests of the 1960s. That was when protest movements broke out on campuses across the United States. Student activists demanded, among other things, civil rights for all Americans, women's rights, an end to the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, and an end to police brutality. The police often responded to the protests with violence, and then the protesters protested the police violence. Those protests were terrifying to people who viewed the protests as chaotic, lawless, and endangering what for centuries had been the American way of life. For the people terrified and angry about the protests, everything was topsy-turvy. White students marched with black students, women wore pants, men grew their hair long, The birth control pill threatened to disrupt what people thought of as the stability of the American family. Young people were experimenting with drugs. The music was different and unsettling. For others, the protests of the 1960s were a part of a thrilling and liberating period of about 26 years that witnessed the end of legalized racial segregation, the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the signing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Immigration Act of 1965. I want to pause for a moment to reflect on the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 because we're still feeling the long-term effects. That act, among other things, abolished national origin quota systems, which had previously favored white immigrants. As a result, there was a profound shift in the nation's demographics because of increased immigration from Asia, Latin America, and Africa. In other words, these pieces of legislation, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the Immigration Act, literally changed the face of America from a mostly white to a more multicultural society. That 26-year period, from the mid-1950s when the Supreme Court ended legalized racial segregation until the 1980 election of Ronald Reagan, was a time of rapid change that some found exhilarating and others found terrifying. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, but not because the good and bad existed together. It was the best of times and the worst of times because for some, it was the best of times. For others, it was the most unsettling of times. To understand reactionaries, the people who want to push backwards and who pine for a bygone era, we need to look at what Hungarian political scientist Bálint Magyar called the democratic Big Bang and the founding conditions. The democratic Big Bang is the event or series of events that establish a democratic government. In the United States, the Big Bang was the Revolutionary War and the ratification of the Constitution. Magyar says that the founding conditions preceding the democratic Big Bang have a decisive role in the formation of this system. Magyar wrote about the states that formed after the Soviet Union broke up, so he talked about the Russian democratic Big Bang. The Russian democratic Big Bang occurred in the early 1990s when the former Soviet Union broke up. Preceding the Russian democratic Big Bang was a communist dictatorship in which the party controlled everything, including all the nation's industries and resources. After the democratic Big Bang, while the Russians were attempting to transition to a democracy, but before democracy was firmly established, the people we now call the ruling oligarchs seized the nation's resources in control of the central government. By 2012, Russia was once more a dictatorship. In other words, within a few decades, Russian regressives pushed the nation all the way back to the founding conditions. Masha Gessen, in her book, How Totalitarianism Reclaimed Russia, argues that this was possible because during the lengthy period of Soviet dictatorship, Russians developed the habits and psychological states that conditioned them to authoritarianism. The founding conditions set the baseline. In contrast to the Russian founding conditions, the colonies that formed the United States had functioning democratic institutions such as jury trials, local elected governments that managed the day-to-day business of the colonies, and constitutions that protected the rights of the colonists. The hitch was that the democratic institutions protected only the rights of white men, but there were democratic institutions with a long history. Our founding conditions included a strict social hierarchy with white men at the top and black women at the bottom. Slavery was part of that hierarchy. The assumption, later articulated by James Henry Hammond as South Carolina senator and wealthy enslaver, was that every society has a hierarchy and those at the bottom serve as mudsills to create the foundation or support. In other words, those at the bottom of the hierarchy labor for the benefit of those at the top. Other founding conditions: women who were not enslaved had minimal rights. Approximately 98% of the population was Protestant. The nation was almost entirely rural. At the time of the Revolutionary War, less than 4% of colonists lived in cities of more than 2,500. Most power resided locally. The king did things like appoint governors people didn't like and collect taxes, but mostly government was local. Gun ownership was part of everyday life. Well, everyday life for white men in colonial and early America. This was particularly true where there were fears of attacks by Native Americans or fears of uprisings among the enslaved population. Gun laws restricted the rights of non-whites to carry guns. The white colonists and early Americans did not want Native Americans or those enslaved getting their hands on guns. Some areas had laws mandating that white men carry guns. In other words, white Protestant men, ruled a mostly rural nation. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times, depending on who you were. Thomas Jefferson had it pretty good. An important word about power: people who have it don't usually want to give it up. People with power come up with theories for why they are the ones who should have and keep the power. Now, compare the conditions today. Our Constitution states in the 14th Amendment that democratic institutions protect all people equally. Women have the full rights of citizenship and are in positions of leadership. The nation is no longer rural. As of 2022, approximately 80% of Americans lived in areas considered urban, which is now defined as a city of more than 5,000 people. Protestants are no longer in the majority. As of 2024, only 40% of Americans describe themselves as Protestant. In the 1950s, 95% of the voters were white. In 2024, white voters made up 71%, and the number is going down. If you want links and sources for all the statistics I'm citing, I put a link to the transcripts in the notes. It's all there. I'm trained as an appellate lawyer, so I give citations for everything. So the thing to remember about these changes from the founding conditions until now is that almost all of them have happened since the 1950s. This means there are Americans alive today who remember a nation ruled by white Protestant men. When the most extreme American regressives want to take us back to a bygone era, the conditions they yearn for are those that preceded and immediately followed the Democratic Big Bang. Consider this definition of Christian nationalism as described in Christianity Today. Christian nationalism is the belief that the American nation is defined by Christianity and that the government should take active steps to keep it that way. America is defined by its Anglo-Protestant past, and we will lose our identity and our freedom if we do not preserve our cultural identity. Anglo, of course, means white. Christian nationalists are alarmed by what is happening. These are the worst of times. They look backward to the best of times. They also argue that these changes are simply un-American. Let's look at their argument. When the Bill of Rights was drafted, at least 6 states had government-supported churches. The state governments of each of the 13 states promoted the religion of their choice. 11 of the 13 states had religious qualifications for holding an office. South Carolina, for example, had a provision in its constitution about religion. The first sentence said this: all persons in religious societies who acknowledge that there is one God and a future state of rewards and punishment, and that God is publicly to be worshipped, shall be tolerated. In other words, you will not be tolerated if you don't agree that God is to be publicly worshipped. The second sentence says this: the Christian Protestant religion shall be deemed and is hereby constituted and declared to be the established religion of the state, that all denominations of Christian Protestants in the state, demeaning themselves peaceably and faithfully, shall enjoy equal religious and civil privileges. So, the founding conditions included a requirement that people worship in the approved manner. The First Amendment opens with what is called the Establishment Clause. Here is what it says: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. It was understood in 1791, when the Bill of Rights was ratified, That Congress shall make no law referred to the United States Congress. The Establishment Clause thus stated that the federal government did not have the power to impose a religion on the nation. State governments, however, could do what they wished. It wasn't until the mid-20th century that the United States Supreme Court held that the Establishment Clause applied to the states as well as the federal government. The decision made some Christian groups very angry. When Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, in 2004, wrote that the Establishment Clause was not intended to protect individual rights, it was intended to protect states' rights, he was not wrong. The counter-argument is that a lot has changed in 200 years, including the 14th Amendment, which was ratified after the Civil War and requires states to respect the rights of individuals. Moreover, there are people who do not want to live in the 18th century. The regressive view of American history is that something vital is being lost or destroyed. For Christian nationalists and others, what has been lost is what they believe is essentially American. Regressives see history as a downward slope. We started off good and pure, and we've been sliding downhill. The progressive view, in contrast, is that American history has been an upward slope. The progressive view of American history is that the founders had some pretty good ideas. The idea of a government based on rule of law instead of the whim of a king, the idea of an independent judiciary, and a government that represents we the people. The problem for progressives is that the founders left out a lot of people. Most progressive forward pushes in American history have been attempts to include more people. Here's the catch. Each push forward has triggered a backlash. The more dramatic the changes, the stronger the backlash. Remember, when we talk about radicals and reactionaries, we're talking about the far ends of the political spectrum, the most extreme positions. Radicals are generally categorized as looking forward to a future utopia. Reactionaries, in contrast, pine for the mythical good old days. Make America Great Again is a reactionary call to arms. Both reactionaries and radicals are willing to break norms and rules to achieve their ends. Like Pinochet's supporters, they argue that sometimes you have to break the rules to save the system. This, by the way, is why arguing that we must break the rules to save democracy is inherently problematic. If you give a green light to rule breaking, you destroy rule of law. Radicals carried out the Russian and French revolutions. What we learn is that the outcomes of revolutions are unpredictable, and often the result is not what the revolutionaries intended or wanted. This is because rapid changes can be destabilizing. The French Revolution erupted in 1789. The goal of the French Revolution was to create a society based on reason and individual rights, with a government respecting the will of the people. The utopian ideal included liberty, equality, and fraternity. In what we may consider a historical irony, within 15 years of the French Revolution, the French had a dictator. What happened is that the rapid changes of the revolution created instability and factionalism. Napoleon came to power by essentially making two promises. He promised stability, and he promised to carry forward the ideals of the revolution. So he appealed to those who wanted order, and he appealed to those who embraced the ideals of the revolution. So he was able to pull together a large coalition. He did, in fact, take steps to equalize citizens. For example, it was Napoleon who decreed that Jewish citizens should have the full rights of citizenship. He also ruled as a dictator. The Russian Revolution of 1917, the Communist Revolution, was also carried out by radicals who looked forward to a better tomorrow. The goal of the Russian Revolution was to eliminate economic classes with a view to eliminating economic oppression. The idea was to create a classless utopia based on the ideas of Karl Marx. Well, it wasn't long before the Russian Revolution went completely off the rails. While the revolutionaries managed to get rid of the Tsar, they ended up with a totalitarian state. A totalitarian government is basically defined as a government in which the people in power have complete control and do not allow anyone the freedom to oppose them. It was mostly Stalin's effort to eliminate all opposition that led to a totalitarian state. The only way to eliminate all opposition is to exert complete control over the population, and because a lot of people don't like being controlled that way, it requires the use of force. Stalin and his supporters justified the use of force and totalitarian methods as necessary to bring about the perfect utopian vision of a classless society. The inherent contradiction in using brutal violence against your own people to create a perfect society should have been obvious, but it wasn't. So, to summarize, when reactionaries want to go backward, they want to go back to the founding conditions. I think I'll stop here. Next time, I plan to talk about how the reactionary desire to return to the founding conditions comes into constant conflict with the progressive yearning for a better tomorrow, and that brings us to where we are today. Thank you for listening. I hope you'll join me next time.